What's up everybody? Welcome back to Make It Custom. I'm Carl Fisher and today's video is something that I've been asked about a bunch of times. It is going to be a TIG welding video. We're going to do a little bit of 10 gauge plate. I'm going to demystify and simplify getting started with TIG welding. I'm not going to go into crazy detail on a bunch of parameters that you don't need to use. We're going to talk about amperage, gas flow, technique, and just simply how can you get started in TIG welding right now and start doing it. So don't forget to like, click subscribe, hit notifications. Let's get into it. So the first thing we're going to go over is the machine. It doesn't matter what machine that you have. You could have a really old one, you could have a new one. It is not going to matter. Today we're going to go over TIG welding steel. So we're going to be using DC TIG welding with a high frequency start. Now, the difference between high frequency and not high frequency, I'm just going to cover it. You're probably not going to need to know it. Scratch start TIG is something that some of the less expensive welders would have, or an older welder where you can actually use almost like a stick welder to start TIG welding. So we're not really going to be doing that because most welders that you purchase, even the cheap ones off of Vever or Amazon, are going to have high frequency start, which just means that you can just start TIG welding without having to scratch the tungsten or do any weird stuff there. So my machine is an imported machine. This is not a name brand thing. This is an inexpensive one from overseas. And when I turn it on, whoops, let's plug it in first. This is a 200 amp machine. I can go up to 200 amps. The rule of thumb I like to use when I'm choosing the amperage that I'm going to be welding at is approximately 1 amp per thou. Okay, so think about that for a second. If you've got sheet metal, like you've seen me do TIG welding on thin sheet metal on car bodies, I'm using this machine and I'm at about 55 amps, 60 amps, that sort of thing, which is pretty relatable to how thickness in thousandths of an inch that auto body sheet metal is. 18 gauge, 19 gauge, that sort of deal. So if you're thinking perhaps we're going to do some welding on 10 gauge material or 1/8, that's about 120 thou thick. So approximately a good place to start with your welding machine is to be at about 120 thousandths or 120 amps, pardon me, because it correlates to the thickness. Now, when we're talking about gas flow, it's not crazy crucial, okay? This is not something where you have to have 17 or 20 or, whatever. It's basically you need enough to cover your weld as you're welding. That's what you're looking for. You don't want porosity. You don't want any kind of contamination by having oxygen get to your weld. So a way to do that, to see where you're at without even looking at the gauge, is just to turn your gas up to more than you need, and you can just kind of keep turning it down until it messes up your weld, and then you just want to be a little bit more than that. Different environments, different situations, different airflow in your shop could affect those things, but other than that, it's not a super crucial number to think about. As far as what type of gas, use pure argon. That's just what I use. I use it for everything. There might be certain scenarios where you could use a different gas, but I've never not used pure argon. Aluminum welding, stainless welding, steel welding, I just use pure argon. So that's all you need to know about the gas. Now, when we're talking, and I'm trying to give you guys the basics, I'm not gonna go into crazy detail. I want you guys to get as much information in a short video that gets you started. So this is a very basic TIG torch. It does not have a water cooler. Right now I've got a FUPA cup. This is called a gas lens. You see these, they are a little bit larger and allows you to actually run your tungsten out even further. Like we would probably have enough gas coverage to run that far out. And the reason why you see a lot of people in industry switching to this is for that reason. Gas coverage, as well as, if you're welding into a roll cage or doing any tight scenarios, you have a little bit of extra visibility and room and reach to get into those spots. Now the traditional cups look more like this. Nothing wrong with them. I've used them for years. Actually, Elio, who's behind the camera, is the one that put me onto these, and I think it's great. There's another great thing about these is that the amount of gas and the way that it's dispersed through this gas lens, which you can see is like a little wire lens in there, has a really even gas flow and allows you to use more gas to help with cooling as well. So there's a couple advantages to going this route, but by all means, if you have a machine and it came with these, nothing wrong with it. You just won't have as much stick out on your tungsten. Today we're gonna be welding with a 3/32 tungsten. I'm gonna be at about 120 amps because we're gonna be welding 1/8-ish material, so about 120 thou. That's the rule of thumb. So I'm saying it again so that it sinks in for you guys. As far as the stick out goes for your tungsten, when you're using a large FUPA cup like this, you can stick it out quite far. Like if it's say 1 inch here, I've got maybe 1.25 inches of stick out. Now if I'm gonna use one of these pink ones, because they're a little bit smaller, basically the rule of thumb, as Elio was just filling me in, is that you don't want it to stick out any more than the distance of the radius of the cup. So for this one, you really couldn't stick it out much more than that. Maybe 3/8 of an inch or so. That's just one of the advantages to going with these gas lens type situations. Okay, and then as far as tungstens go, I use the red tungsten for doing things like steel. That's if you have an older machine that you use a 2% thoriated tungsten. That's usually the one that has a little bit of red on the end. Now the newer machines that are all inverter technology, if you have a newer machine, this is likely the type of machine you have. They like to use 2% lanthiated, which is a tungsten that has a little bit of blue on it, and it's kind of good for everything. So those are your choices. You know, green is a pure tungsten that you can use for stainless steel, aluminum as well. We are going to focus today on just welding mild steel, because if you're working on cars or doing things like I'm doing, that's the most common thing that you're doing. So I think what we're going to do to get started is actually, before we do that, let's just take this apart and have a look at the parts. Okay, so I might not even tell you exactly what they're called, but let's just have a look at how they're assembled. So this cap, they make all sorts of different sizes of these. If you need to get into smaller spots, you can cut your tungsten smaller, and you can use smaller ones of those. This is obviously the cup and the gas lens. That piece right there. And then this is actually what holds onto your tungsten. So this Furric brand has this type of a collet. Is that a collet? Yeah. This is a collet.
That's a wedge collet.
This is a wedge collet that when it gets tightened, it basically gets pushed on by this, on this side, it pushes on it and rams the wedged end into, what is this called?
Gas lens.
This is not a gas lens, is it?
Yeah, that's the gas.
Is that not a gas lens?
That's the lens.
This is the cup, and
that's
then this
cup.
is the gas lens?
Yeah, that's the gas lens.
It's a good thing we got Elio here. I don't even know what these things are called. Okay, so gas lens. Nice about this is that you can use the same 332 for 1/16 and 332. You just change your collet. So basically this goes inside there, and when these are threaded, it pushes on the collet and tightens onto the tungsten. That's how it works. Okay, so there's that. And then your gas comes out this lens and through the cup, and I think this is also a lens, is it not?
Yeah.
This is a lens as well. So that's how they are assembled in your torch. Now, if you're just getting started in TIG welding, I suggest that you just use the pedal and amperage, and you just start by steadily creating an arc onto a piece of metal, and you can just see how the arc grows. You can watch the puddle. You can learn a lot just from doing that. You know, how to hold your tungsten, or how to hold your torch in a comfortable way where you are steady and you're able to be accurate with being steady. Now, we're holding our tungsten very close to the metal a lot of the times, and you'll have to regrind your tungsten because you might touch the metal, you might touch your filler. So these are all things that you can practice by being really steady and just arcing onto a piece of metal. So we're gonna start with that right now. I'm just gonna set the machine up at 120 amps, and we're just gonna roll onto the pedal. We're gonna create an arc and build a puddle, and then we're gonna stop. We're just gonna practice that, do that a few times. We're gonna add some filler material. When you add filler material, you'll see that the heat from your weld also has to heat the filler material, so you do need to have a little bit more power to compensate for that cold material that you're adding that also has to be heated up. So anytime you dip your weld, it actually cools it because you're having to heat up another piece of metal. So that's something to think about when you're welding. So I'm gonna set up for that. We'll put this thing back together. We're just gonna do some little dots on this piece of metal. Then we'll graduate to little beads, and then we're gonna start doing actual beads and joints together. Thing I'm gonna also go over is the tungsten grind, okay? So we do have to grind these tungstens, and this is sharpened to a point similar to a pencil. Might be tough to see there. For the most part, the angle that you have it, meaning how sharp it is it a 90-degree angle? Is it, you know, is it sharper? Is it less? That basically is the actual shape of the arc coming off of there. So if you have a point that's very sharp, well, your arc coming off of that point will be similarly sharp, meaning your puddle could be smaller if your tungsten is sharper, your puddle is smaller. If your tungsten is more dull, then your puddle will also be more dull or wider. So that is something to think about. For the most part, for myself, my own experience, I pretty much sharpen them almost all the same all the time. I just go about 3 times the thickness of the tungsten is the length of my sharpen, between 2 to 3 times, depending. Special situations, you might want something sharper or less sharp, depending on building up a weld on thicker material or having a smaller weld on thinner material. So it's kind of a rule of thumb, but something you can play with at home. Not everybody does the same thing, so like I said, these are the basics, and then you can sort of take it from there. All right, torch is back together. I've got 120 amps. I've got about 25 cubic feet per hour as my flow rate for gas. And like I said, this is one of those gas lenses that diffuses it a little bit better, so we do have a little bit better gas coverage, and we are able to have that much stick out. It's very important to be able to see really well when you're TIG welding. It's also very important to be comfortable when you're TIG welding. So you want to make sure that you've got rests. You want to hold the TIG torch in such a way that you have control over it. You have control over your pencil that way. That's how you should hold your TIG torch too. Or it's kind of how I like to hold mine. I hold my TIG torch like this, choked up on the end. I've got my finger on top. This allows me to have my arm against the table. It allows me to have just incredible amounts of control because I need it for TIG welding when you're getting close to the material. The other thing I wanted to give you as a bit of a rule of thumb is the thickness of your tungsten approximately is how far you should have the tip of your tungsten away from the material. So I guess the length of your arc should be approximately the thickness of your tungsten, more or less. A little bit more, probably never less. But that's the other thing. What we're gonna do now is we're just going to do these dots here. I'm just gonna use my foot pedal. I'm gonna roll on. I'm gonna try and be steady. I'm gonna watch myself create a little dot and then let it cool. So I'm gonna roll on to my amperage and then roll back off. This is what I want you guys to practice if this is your first time. So here we go. I'm gonna keep going.
Yep.
So right now you just want to make sure that your arc is nice and steady, that your hand is nice and steady. You want to see yourself make that puddle and then also roll off of it. So once you've mastered the art of creating tiny little dots, we're going to move to moving. So we're going to do small little beads. We're not adding filler yet. We're just trying to get comfortable with moving while the arc is on. So I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to do maybe 3/4 of an inch or an inch long, trying to keep my travel speed consistent as well as my arc length. One more thing to consider is that usually when you're welding, well, most of the time when you're welding, you've got your filler in your left hand if you're right-handed, you want to angle your tungsten and your torch in the direction of travel, okay? This does a couple of things for you. Number one, gives you a great view of what's happening. Number two is it makes your puddle turn into a little bit of an oval. And that's kind of a key thing, because now your puddle is extending in front of your tungsten, giving you a place that you can add filler without crossing your actual arc. Now, if you were to put filler right through your arc, it would ball up and drop a piece of filler, and you would never be able to dip it into the puddle. So by giving yourself an angle in the direction of travel and an oval puddle now, as you're traveling, you have a place to dip. You have a puddle to dip into rather than burning up your tungsten before it hits your puddle. So like I said, we're just gonna do a few short lines trying to control our hand and move without changing our arc length, meaning the distance away from the material, and without wiggling around too much. So get comfortable, try and hold this tungsten or your torch in such a way that you can be solid about it, and give this a shot. So I'm just trying to be as consistent as I can. I want the puddle to just be the same width the whole way. So I'm starting my puddle, and then I'm starting to move, and shutting it off. If you go slower, your puddle will be wider. If you go faster, it will be narrower. And those are just some of the things that you'll get the feel for as we move along. Now, one more thing I'll mention is that there is a post flow of the gas, which means that as soon as you stop the arc, it will have a timer that will keep the gas on after you've stopped the arc. That's called post flow. There's another thing called pre-flow as well. We're not going to get into that because it's not necessary right now. But the post flow allows your weld to be shielded while it's still hot and molten. If it were to cut the gas immediately while it was cooling, there's potential for that oxygen to contaminate your weld right when you finish. So depending on how hot things are, how big things are, you might have more or less post flow. For mine, I've got just a few seconds of post flow at the moment, and that's plenty enough to wait for my weld to solidify so that it does not have some kind of inclusion in it, contamination. So now that we've got our dots and dashes figured out and we're getting comfortable, and you might have to do, 10 of these or 20 of these, whatever it may be. Now we're gonna start introducing filler material. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna use a 1/16 filler, which I hopefully have. Oh, I know where they are. My little hiding spot inside the table. So now that you've got dots and dashes, we're gonna start moving along and just adding a little bit of material. What I'm looking for here is that you guys just are as consistent as possible. Move a little bit, dab it. Move a little bit, dab it. Move a little bit, dab it. Try and be consistent. That's all you're trying to do. Fill my puddle up. I'm gonna give it a dab, move along, give it a dab, move along, give it a dab, move along, give it a dab, move along. It's a very woggly looking weld. I actually have to add a little bit more amperage because I could just tell that that was not happening fast enough. Now that I'm cooling the weld with this material, I need a little bit of extra heat. So instead of being at 120, I'm gonna go up to 130. And right now I am full throttle hammer down. That's what I'm doing. Because it's a variable foot pedal, if you need to back off or give yourself more, you can. But for learning, I would say set your welder so that you can just floor it. You can worry about figuring out that later, as far as your foot control. But right now, when we're just trying to concentrate on being as steady as possible, you don't need to add a third limb into it. So right now, I know I need a little bit more heat, so I'm bumping up the welder and I'm gonna still just floor it. was a much nicer weld because I was able to move a little bit faster because I had a little bit more heat. That is, all that really is playing with your heat settings and the speed that you feel you're allowed to go. Now, it's something I'm gonna try and explain to you guys because this is personal experience. I worked for a shop when I was first learning how to TIG weld, and he kept saying that my welds were too hot. He kept saying that my welds were too hot. They looked too hot, they were too hot, and I was welding pretty cold, that I thought. And I couldn't understand why is this guy telling me my welds are too hot? You know, I feel like I'm welding as cold as I can weld. Well, that is another misconception about TIG welding, or something that could be confusing, is that if you are really slow with what you're doing, the slower you are, the hotter things are getting. So to have a cooler weld, sometimes you have to have higher amperage, but move faster. So think about that for a second, is that if you're stalling, you're heating up all the metal around and you're preheating everything around what you're trying to do, and it's actually making the weld hotter, uglier, and more brittle. So it is important to go at a speed that you can use the proper amperage, which in some cases is a little hotter for your weld to be cooler. I know it's something to think about, but you'll figure it when you try it. All right, so I want you guys to practice adding a little bit of filler and just doing consistent beads. Try having a little less heat and see how slow you have to go, and then try having a little bit more heat and speeding it up. And when you're done your weld, you'll see how much heat is in the material by, you know, the penetration, or the heat lines, the discoloration that happens around your weld, and you'll know what I mean by slower is hotter. It's a weird thing to get a hold of, but you guys will figure it out. So I think next what we're gonna do, and like I said, take your time, like don't move on to the next thing unless you're comfortable with this one. We're gonna start off with a T-joint. This is very, you know, common inside corner type welding. I'm gonna do that with filler. And what I'm gonna do with this is, I think I'm gonna do it in such a way where I'm gonna just have the amperage constant. So I'm gonna set the machine like I was saying, so that you guys don't have to think about, you know, trying to find your place on the pedal. I want you to set your amperage so that you can just floor it and know that that's the amperage that you're gonna use. That's at least one variable that you can take out of the equation once you've set your amperage. That's what we're gonna do right now. So I'm gonna start off with the amperage that I have, which is 130 amps, and just see if that's hot enough, cold enough, where it is. So I'm gonna tack this piece together, and then I'm gonna give it a try with a little bit of 1/16 filler, 3/32 tungsten. Let's do it. Now when you're tacking, a lot of the times if it's tight enough, you can just do it with fusion. You don't need to have any filler material, so that's what I'm gonna do right here. A little fusion tack. The same thing on this side. Oh, touched my tungsten. If you ever touch your tungsten with anything, if you touch it to your puddle or you touch it to your filler material, you gotta regrind it, okay? Some people, I've talked to people that say that you don't need to regrind it, it still arcs and you can still make a weld. Sure you can. You can still do all that. But when you have a sharp tungsten, your arc is also sharp. If you have a tungsten that has, you know, where you've had to break it off the piece of metal it's stuck to or something like that, the arc itself is going to be disrupted by whatever shape the end of the tungsten is. So if you have a ball on the end, or if it's sharp, or if it's broken, it's all going to be different coming off of it, and your arc may dance around, or it may kind of go to one side. So for learning purposes, and in all cases, you know, you should always have nice and sharp tungstens. One thing I like to do is I like to pre-sharpen a bunch of them. I know that I'm gonna stick them. If you just sharpen it once and then mess it up and you have to walk to your grinder again, it doesn't make sense. So try and get a few tungstens, sharpen them both sides so that they're here and you can just continue welding. All right, so same deal as anything else. I'm gonna be in the direction of travel. I think we should do this flat position like this, just easier to see, right?
Yep.
Rather than horizontal. It is the same as far as your angle. You know, I'm gonna be kind of vertical this way in the angle direction of travel, but if I was doing this horizontal, I would be, you know, still the same deal. It's 45 degrees so that you're pointing right in the center of that, and we're just gonna move along like this, so. One more thing with TIG welding that I probably could have said this earlier because this is very important. TIG welding, you must have clean material. Like, I mean clean, no mill scale. If you do a plasma cut, like these were cut on my plasma cutter, but even where it cuts it, you have to grind that off because it will get a thing called mill scale, or any material that is not cold rolled steel. Like if you have hot rolled steel and it's got that scale on it, TIG welding doesn't like that, okay? So using cold rolled steel, or if it's hot rolled steel, you must grind off the mill scale. You must have it clean. The cleaner your material, the better it's gonna be to weld. TIG does not like mill scale. You can MIG weld it all day, but TIG welding, you don't want it, promise. Okay, now that we're tacked, we're gonna get onto this. Like I said, I'm gonna hold this torch angled in the direction of travel by about 35 degrees, similar to what I say when we're MIG welding, and then it will be, you know, 45 degrees to that workpiece. So it'll be directly in the center and angled forward so that we can make this weld happen. I am gonna set the welder so that it has a constant amperage, and you'll see that every dip I make is what's gonna make our little bead kind of dimes. People talk about stacking dimes. It's every time you drop the filler material, it makes that little C shape. So let's give this a try. Okay, full throttle.
Wow.
So whenever you start a weld, it's a little bit colder, so it might take a second while you're still there. I think I could have actually juiced my amperage up maybe just a little bit to move a little bit faster, but for the most part, I'm pretty happy with that weld, although it is a little bit too concave for my taste, and that just means that there isn't quite enough filler there, which is also an indication that it was a little bit too cold. I wish I could have added a little bit more filler. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna up my amperage to about 140, and we're gonna give it a try again. So when you're welding, MIG welding, TIG welding, anything, you definitely want to have a weld that is, you know, a tiny bit convex or kind of flat. If it's under, I mean, they look pretty, that's a pretty looking weld, but it's not quite adequate because it's undercut a little bit. So the weld technically isn't as strong as it could be. So when you're filling, you want to be able to fill enough that it is an adequate weld. So that's why I turned it up a little bit so that I'll have a little more heat so that I can add a little bit more filler, because like I said before, the filler cools the weld. So if you need to add more filler, you're gonna need a little bit more heat. Also, the different joint designs, like we're going with an inside corner here, it takes a little more heat to do an inside corner than it does, say, a butt weld. So there's some variances there. So this is 140 amps, 1/16 filler, 332 tungsten. We'll give it a try. I'm also dipping a little bit more often here to get enough filler in. So that second weld is a lot stronger because it's got a little bit more fill. This is 150 amps, full throttle, dabbing it in. Now I want to tell you guys that when I do weld, some of the times, I would say most of the time, this is just my personal preference, I throttle the pedal. So I'll add a lot more amperage than I would normally use, and I will use more amperage only when I'm filling, and I back it off as I'm moving. So that's something that you can play around with later, but that's just the way that I kind of drop my dimes into whatever I'm welding. But for this tutorial type situation for beginners, I think it's easier to start with as many consistencies as you can have. So we're eliminating variables by not having a variable foot pedal right now. Okay, so 150 amps, 1/16 filler, 3/30 seconds tungsten. So a little bit bigger weld. I was able to get a little bit more filler in there, but I also noticed that my tungsten is a little bit contaminated based on the way that the arc was coming off of that. I'm not sure if I dipped it or what happened there, but I'm going to change it. I do want to show you guys me throttling it and what the difference is. I'm also just kind of interested because I don't normally weld like that. I kind of want to see what the difference is. You know, my welding teacher would call this mechanical pulse or manual pulse. Machines nowadays can be set to do this pulse, but you know, back when I was doing my welding school, this is called manual pulse. All right, let's try another joint, okay? We're gonna do a butt weld, and we're also gonna do an outside corner joint. So let's start with that. So for a butt weld, same idea. I'm just angled in the direction of travel so that I've got that oval in front of my tungsten that I'm gonna be able to dip my filler into. I think for this weld, like I said, I'll do a constant. I'm not gonna pulse this, I'm just gonna do it with a constant amperage. So I'm probably gonna bring this down to maybe 120. We'll start there because this type of a weld with a gap in there will take less heat to make it burn. So. Okay, we're gonna give it a shot at 130. Ooh, look at how much that material choked up, eh?
Yeah.
It actually contracted quite a bit. Okay, so that one was at 130. So there's a bit of an outside corner, same idea. You just always got to keep your eye on the puddle. Every time I'm dipping, I'm kind of watching that the puddle doesn't get too much wider. You kind of want to dip and see that your puddle gets to the same size as the previous one. Something else I want to show you guys is just fusion, because a lot of cases you can fuse things together and you might not even have to add filler. In this case, we're just going to do fusion because it's something that you can practice as far as moving your arm and TIG welding. It's so important to be comfortable. You see how I've got this up on my shoulder here? It's because the weight of this against the ground, every time I move this, the weight of this is kind of affecting how much this wiggles. So if you can put the weight of your torch and your line over your shoulder, now this becomes much lighter, easier to control. So that's just one more thing that you can think about. So let's do a little bit of fusion right here. I'm not gonna use filler at all. I'm just going to try and steadily move my hand along. And this is something I like to practice as well, is if I'm gonna do a weld that I don't want to stop during the weld, I will, without the welder on, I will try and steadily move along the weld joint and see if I have enough reach with my hand position, okay? So if I started a little bit further, I might be able to finish a little bit more solid, rather than starting here and trying to reach for that last little bit. If I can move over and start here, then maybe by the time I get to the end, I'm a little bit more solid. So it all depends on whatever you guys want to use as a rest, or however comfortable you can make yourself. It's worth it, whatever it is. These are all the things that you're going to figure out for yourself as you go. So have a look at how I hold this. It's always in kind of like a pencil type writing implement sort of way, so that you have more control. You do want to be resting on whatever you can. If it helps to grab something that's like, this is a little bit taller than when we were welding flat. So if I wanted to rest, perhaps I get a scrap of steel, and then I can put my hand resting on this. Actually, that's much more comfortable. Much more comfortable. So that's what I'm gonna do. So let's just fuse this without filler for a little bit, just to show you guys. So you're just gonna build the puddle up, and just like we were doing on the dots and dashes, you're just gonna try and be as consistent as you can and run along that joint. So here we've got the fill. We've got our puddle started. I'm just running it straight along, trying to be as consistent as I can, watching that the size bead stays consistent. I wiggled a little bit at the end. Look at that, how consistent it is. You can see where my wiggle is, but just try and be as consistent as you can. These are all techniques that are gonna help you be a better welder. So, all right, so I'm gonna stop this video here. I want you guys to tell me in the comments if you found this video helpful, or if there's more techniques that you would like to hear from me as far as how to do this, or more examples that I can give you. This will not be the only TIG welding video that I put out, but it is the first on thicker material. So the next one you might see will be strictly on thin material. We'll probably do the same sort of idea. So thanks a lot for watching Make It Custom, everybody. Thank you, Elio, behind the camera, and I appreciate you guys. If you guys want another way to support the channel, there's always the custom crew. There's a little button at the end of this video. It's $5 a month, really helps me out. Also helps you get 15% off discount on our merch store, which is japhandskustoms.com, and it gives you a badge by your name that I search every time in the comments to make sure that I get back to those guys, as well as answer as many questions as I can in the comments. So thanks a lot once again. I appreciate your support, everybody. Have a great week, and we'll catch you next time on Make It Custom. Cheers.